Welcome to the 129th season of the Canadian Club Toronto, Canada's podium. For over a century, this stage has united visionaries and leaders from politics, business, community, and the arts to share insights on the most pressing issues of our time. And with Canada in a pivotal moment, it's more important than ever that we come together.
We've been having important discussions and debates around this podium in this country for well over a century. I call this a historic podium of record.
Our club's always been a forum for visionaries, public figures, and decision makers to command attention to the issues of our time.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. So I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
Good afternoon again, members and guests, and a warm welcome to those joining us online. My name is Shazanne Chu, President of Canadian Club Toronto, and your host today. Ontario's Ring of Fire remains one of the country's most significant economic opportunities, one that increasingly sits at the intersection of Indigenous partnership, infrastructure development, energy transition, and Canada's long-term competitiveness. Before we begin our program today, I would like to recognize our presenting sponsors, Deloitte and Enbridge. Thank you for your support and partnership. To our season sponsors, the Canadian Bankers Association and the Carpenters Regional Council, and to our official airline sponsor, Air Canada, thank you for your continued support. Thank you as well to the Canada's Forest Trusts, our nature partner, who help us reduce our carbon footprint by planting a smart forest in our honor. We are also delighted to welcome students from the University of Toronto's Political Science program joining us today. We're very pleased to have you with us. And now let me take a moment to remind you of our website and its on-demand content. Please visit canadianclub.org, and while you're there, consider becoming a member if you aren't already. And we also appreciate it when you post about our event on your social media platform of choice. It helps us spread the conversation beyond this room. And now I'm sure you'll have questions about Indigenous economic partnership, critical minerals, and the future of development in Northern Ontario. So please use the question cards on your tables. And for those joining us remotely, please use the Submit a Question button on the right side of your screen. Our team will be looking out for them and we'll share them with our moderator today. Following today's keynote remarks, Minister Rickford will be joined by the Honourable Lisa Raitt. And now it is my pleasure to invite Dean Janvier, partner Deloitte, to formally introduce today's speaker. Dean, welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dean Janvier. I'm a proud member of Cold Lake First Nation in Northern Alberta. I'm Dene, also a partner at Deloitte. Very happy to be here. Thank you all for coming today. It's a pleasure to be here at the Canadian Club in Toronto. And on behalf of Deloitte, I'd like to thank you for being here for this important conversation. Ontario is in a very important moment in how it continues to build its relationships with Indigenous peoples. And among other projects and opportunities, the Ring of Fire represents one of the most significant opportunities in Ontario, not only because of its potential for critical minerals and infrastructure, which the world needs at this time in great quantities, but because of what it asks of all of us. It asks us, how do we move forward? How do we move together? And who will have a seat at that table to discuss those matters? And it asks us whether development can create lasting benefits, not only for all of Ontario and the North, but also for all of the Indigenous nations that are whose land upon which Ontario is now a part of. So from my perspective, there's only one way that people can move forward together. It's through strong and respectful and sustained partnerships. But there's one other ship that must come in before partnership, and that's relationship. And I think, relationship is something that we're all looking right now at this time to work together on. And so the first part of this is going to be dialogue and listening to each other. So that's what we're here today to do. So with that, that's why today's conversation matters. The work ahead has to be grounded in partnership, respect, shared benefit, and that helps to create more hope. Hope that can be part of responsible development that will build stronger communities and bring us closer together in shared economic success. So with that, I'd like to introduce the Honourable Greg Rickford, Ontario's Minister of Indigenous Affairs and First Nations Economic Reconciliation. I'm not going to read the whole thing that you heard earlier. This one's shorter. Also, Minister responsible for Ring of Fire, Economic and Community Partnerships. As you know, he's held several senior portfolios in the Ontario government, including Energy, Natural Resources, Northern Development, and has been closely involved in advancing the province's approach to critical minerals and Indigenous partnerships. Also, he'll be joined by our friend, the Honourable Lisa Raitt, Vice Chair of Global Investment Banking at CIBC Capital Markets. She brings extensive experience from her time in federal public office, including as Minister of Natural Resources, and continues to play a leading role in conversations about Canada's economic future and major project development. Together, they will explore how partnerships are shaping the path forward for economic prosperity for Ontario, for Canada, and what this means for communities, industry, and the province as a whole. Please join me in welcoming the Honourable Greg Rickford and Lisa Raitt.
Well, how about the Canadian Club of Toronto and this extraordinary group that we have here today? Thank you so much. And first off, I want to acknowledge Chief Margaret Sull, Chief of Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and a real leader, especially, and it feels great after your important words to have settled the Rouge River land claim settlement. You and your predecessor, Claire, is much appreciated, and it feels a lot better when we talk about this being the treaty lands of your First Nation. I appreciate your leadership, Chief. I also want to recognize here today that there are a number of folks who I've had the great privilege of working with over 2 chapters of my political career, and I appreciate their support and for being here today. You're an awesome group, and you know who you are. Folks, I want to start out by talking about an airplane hangar in Tyendinaga, Mohawk Territory, on the shores of Bay of Quinte. It belongs to the First Nations Technical Institute and is the only Indigenous aviation program in the country. The Institute has been training pilots for generations, and with over 40% of their graduates being women, significantly outpacing the broader aviation industry, where female pilots make up only about 5% of all commercial pilots. 4 years ago, their original training hangar was lost in a devastating fire, and rebuilding efforts are underway. But when the work is complete, they'll have a state-of-the-art facility to train the next generation of Indigenous pilots. These are women and men who know the airspace because they and their families have lived under it for time immemorial. They know the protocols of the communities that they are flying into because these are the places that they call home. No flight school can replicate that training, and no airline wants to operate in the north of this country without them and their knowledge. Please hold that picture in your mind as I proceed, because everything I'm about to say, including our discussion about the Ring of Fire, goes back to that important story. It could be other trades and skills, thinking of the women welders in Timmins, at the bucket shop, young men leading economic development operations in First Nations communities in and around the Ring of Fire, including, and importantly, a new generation of political leaders. Because the picture answers a question that does not get asked often enough in rooms like this one. And that is, who is going to build this country in the decade ahead? It's not that we cannot talk about financing it with First Nations as partners. I'll speak more about that in a moment. First Nations are now working with large construction companies and union organizations on designing and planning to build major projects. Some of you are here today, and I appreciate it. But the question is, who is going to build on our nation's major projects moving forward? From where I'm standing and the work our government is doing, I hope to make the case today that it's pretty clear the biggest projects in this province are going to be built in full partnership with First Nations and largely by their people. Not eventually, not symbolically. I mentioned this on stage at PDAC with the chiefs of Martin Falls and Webagway. I said, you know, we have to get ready here. If First Nations people don't build these roads, they are likely not to get built. We don't have enough or any more Newfoundlanders around to help us with our major projects. They're busy in their province and others across this country. That's not an issue. That's an opportunity. I said, let's get ready. Let's really unpack what it is we have to do. And now represented here today are those business leaders, legal experts, talented engineers and consultants, successful Indigenous entrepreneurs who actually understand this. I see folks from Mind Connect offering educational program to young First Nations people, leaders from Wailu developing a world-class eco-friendly mine at Eagle's Nest and Black Thor, love those names, in the Ring of Fire. Friends from Kiewit leading the way with innovative equity partnerships like the Talicho Road model in the Northwest Territories, all with a shared vision to expand and foster First Nations partnerships in major projects. So let's talk about economic reconciliation. It was raised in remarks earlier, and it became part of my title just a couple of years ago, since I was here last. Under the Premier's leadership, he understood the need to shift our focus on economic reconciliation. It made sense. First Nations political and business leaders were all talking about it. The question is, how would we do this? It's become a story of meaningful partnerships, building relationships that send a clear message about how development in Ontario could and should operate, with First Nations as full partners every step of the way. We made a commitment to do things differently than governments of the past, by building consensus around shared priorities, leading to shared prosperity. Not decisions made for communities, decisions made with communities. And so, since coming to government in 2018, there's been some important catch-up work to do. It's work that I understood well in my capacity as a lawyer, the need for our government to address grievances of the past. They came in the form of land claims, flood claims, and treaty disputes. We have settled more in the past 8 years than any other government in Ontario's history combined. These are important tools for First Nations communities and their journey for self-determination. And we believe that it's a foundation to create conditions for communities to take a look at long-term growth and opportunity ahead. Let's talk about that, the geography of opportunity. It's a phrase that me and my team came up with, and I kind of like it because to understand it and how this works, you first have to understand the scale of Ontario itself. It covers more than 1 million square kilometers, approximately 4.5 times the size of the United Kingdom. I use that country because I was just there a couple of weeks ago with a number of First Nations business leaders. Ontario is a big place. And from my home in northwestern Ontario, 45 minutes from the Manitoba border, it takes nearly 22 hours to drive to Toronto. So yeah, we're kind of big. There are 133 First Nation communities in Ontario, and nearly 80% of them located in the north. At 1 in 4 communities being remote and isolated, Ontario has the highest number of remote First Nations communities in Canada, something people don't know. And at nearly 3,200 kilometers, Ontario has Canada's largest winter road network that connects 32 isolated First Nations communities, of which I've had a chance to work and serve as a nurse and/or a lawyer in most. Of course, with the impacts of climate change and the high cost of fuel, it has spurred serious discussions and plans for isolated First Nations communities in Ontario to develop all-season road networks, a Herculean task in its own right. Think about that for just a moment. Imagine trying to build an economy, build a business, build access to better services and programs for economics, businesses, and healthcare, or to train a workforce without permanent road access. And yet, despite these barriers, these communities continue to lead with resilience, determination, and vision. And frankly, I'm just happy to be a part of that. The conclusion most governments have come to in the past, have drawn from that geography for a better part of a century, is that the workforce in those places is impossible to train at scale. Government policies have been bailed out by ad hocery. No consistent or coherent plan has come along until, I believe, under the leadership of Premier Ford and this incredible opportunity that I have to explore meaningful community and economic partnerships, have we discovered that there is not only willing communities and willing partners, but also a workforce. So the workforce imperative. 1.3 million Ontarians work in skilled trades today, and we are still incredibly short of the workers that we need. We need skilled workers in trades, in critical minerals, in construction of massive projects, in aviation, as I mentioned, in every industry that will decide whether the decade in front of us is one in which Canada leads or one in which we are led. Northern Ontario alone will require more than 21,000 tradespeople over the next 10 years. We have people in this country who want to do that work, who know the industries from the inside, and who know the regions of Canada better than anyone. They include and are situated prominently as First Nations. The barriers between them and work are not barriers of talent. They are, over the course of time, proved to be barriers of design. A certification system designed for Southern Ontario people who never imagined a young tradesperson in Northern Ontario wanting to make or take the test. Last week, our government opened a new apprenticeship examination center in Kenora. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but boy, did it ever go over well in my community. Just think, until last week, there was not an apprenticeship testing center west of Thunder Bay. So roughly no testing center in Germany, let's just say, to size. Skilled tradespeople in roughly the size of the European country had to travel to Thunder Bay and often parts beyond to achieve their certification. The new examination center is hosted at 7 Generations Kenora campus, culturally appropriate, with supports, and the 24th examination site in a province-wide network. More than 5,000 final-level apprenticeship examinations have been delivered through that network in the past 12 months alone, a nearly 400% increase year over year. That's an incredible record for a province. The skilled trades pipeline of one of the most resource-rich regions on the continent is now running through First Nations capacity and opportunity. And get this, folks, Indigenous youth are the current fastest-growing group in Ontario's workforce. The work of government, then, is to remove barriers, not to relocate the workforce. That can happen under certain circumstances, but to redesign programs around where the workforce already lives, already works, and already raises its children and supports its community. So let's talk about how financing ownership and not just consultation can build on a workforce that we have a much better understanding about. For many years, Indigenous involvement was framed around the duty to consult and impact benefit agreements. But all too often, what that really meant was that major projects, legacy infrastructure, and resource development happened all around the communities and not with them. Communities were treated as stakeholders rather than as partners. Folks, that architecture has fundamentally changed under our government. It is structural. It is not symbolic. The Premier understood that to meet the moment, we could no longer treat consultation and impact benefit agreements as boxes to check. Instead, the paradigm has necessarily shifted, focusing on capacity building, meaningful community and economic partnerships, sharing the risk and the reward. So how do we actually achieve that? Well, since the last time I spoke, we have tripled Ontario's loan guarantee program from $1 billion to $3 billion, rebranding and leading the country in our commitment to ensure First Nations have access to capital through the Indigenous Opportunity Financing Program. We are no longer confined to just transmission lines. The program now includes legacy infrastructure, opportunities in the forest sector, road construction, mining, and nuclear, all the industries that will be the foundation of Ontario's economy moving forward. Importantly, we also move that program into the Building Ontario Fund, some of whom are, including Taylor, I think, are here today. It's an agency run by professionals from private equity, banking, and pension funds, and it's an effort to fully integrate Indigenous capital and participation in all major projects born from government policy. The results speak for themselves. $250 million for Saugeen Ojibwe Nation's partnership with Bruce Power for medical isotope production, something that I was proudly involved with in my capacity as the former Minister of Natural Resources under Prime Minister Harper. $300 million for 24 partnering First Nations in the Wate Power transmission projects. And in the coming months, you will hear of more projects tied into legacy infrastructure that supports the construction of critical mineral mines in the not-too-distant future. Ownership stakes in aggregate operations, accommodations, and aerodromes being built through Webequie and Martin Falls partnerships in the Ring of Fire. That is what it looks like when you stop talking about inclusion and start financing it. So what about these critical minerals? Everybody's talking about them. They're all the rage. In fact, a former U.S. president said that we have lots of critical minerals. I don't know who he was talking about in the United States, and I don't dismiss their source of critical minerals, but I think he was talking, I'm pretty sure he was talking about Canada. And that matters because Canada is now engaged in a fundamentally different conversation about critical minerals. The world is short of lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, and the rare earth elements that determine whether a country can build batteries, electric vehicles, and the defense systems that protect people. Right now, the world is getting most of its critical minerals from China, Indonesia, and Russia, countries with some of the worst human rights and labor standards the world over. That must change, and it will. And Ontario, in partnership with First Nations, is stepping forward to meet that moment. In our first 4 years, we opened and moved 4 mining projects off the shelf and into the marketplace. The Sugar Zone, Côté Gold, Magino, and Greenstone Gold are all examples of how full and effective community and economic partnerships can move major mining operations to extraction and processing. Ontario now ranks as the #1 jurisdiction in Canada for mining investment and is pre-positioned nicely to take on major critical mineral development projects. The value proposition, ladies and gentlemen, for investment in Ontario is now. And it's based on the certainty born from regulatory and economic partnerships, if not leadership, from First Nations. And when I authored Ontario's first critical mineral strategy, we signaled a clear intention to capture the entire supply chain of critical minerals, from earth to electric vehicles, from mines to motors, in corridors throughout Ontario that included First Nations proponency. Global capital looking for ethical, traceable exposure to critical minerals is now looking at us and how we do things. The defense industries of our closest allies are taking a close look at us, and the question is whether we are ready to look back. So let's talk about the Ring of Fire and other critical mineral sites across Northern Ontario. For years, we've talked about the Ring of Fire as something buried beneath the surface, minerals in the ground, potential waiting to be unlocked. The truth is, the opportunity before us today is not in the ground, it's on the ground. The opportunity is to improve health, social, and economic futures of First Nations people. This is something that I've aptly framed as the corridor to prosperity. As First Nations governments and businesses and the provincial government, and hopefully more meaningfully the federal government, align our priorities, and we understand the opportunity at this moment. And it is to ensure that those isolated First Nations communities have the same line of sight to some of the basic but modern infrastructure that we sometimes take for granted. These communities require significant investment and development, and this, my friends, is where the opportunity rests. The country that gets the workforce question right for the future is the country that ends up owning the supply chain and what flows out of it. And it's First Nations political and business leaders across this country, but for the purposes of today in Ontario, are more frequently hosting high-profile economic and legacy infrastructure conferences. The country that gets it wrong sells the resource, imports the labor, and watches wealth depart through the same airports and shipping lanes it came through. We're not going to make that mistake. In March, Premier Ford and I announced that construction on the road to the Ring of Fire will begin this year in 3 different locations, with all routes completed by 2031. That is precisely 5 years ahead of schedule. The Webequie Supply Road breaks ground this June. The Martin Falls Community Access Road follows in August. And what was supposed to be a secret, I'll just share with you now, we will actually break ground in Geraldton, the baseline access to the corridor to prosperity, next week in Geraldton. So this is not a distant promise. This is happening now. And in December 2025, Ontario and Canada signed a historic cooperation agreement to streamline approvals under a one project, one process, one decision model, removing duplication between federal and provincial reviews while maintaining robust environmental standards and assessments that are now being led by First Nations communities. I love the sound of that. The province has also entered into economic partnership agreements and community partnership agreements with the municipality of Greenstone, Arrowland First Nation, Martin Falls First Nation, and Webequie First Nations. Agreements that ensure these communities are full partners in the responsible development of their own territory. We are also doing this with other resource projects across the north. I see some folks from Frontier Lithium here today, and they know that Pikangikum is taking a leadership role on building a bridge across the mighty Barrens River, unlocking several isolated First Nations communities, accessing an exquisite fiber basket in the White Feather Forest, and a world-class lithium deposit in Frontier's PAC project. Industry, government, and communities all see opportunities ahead of us, achievable through these kinds of community and economic partnerships. The opportunities is in the roads we're ready to build, roads that will connect communities that have been isolated for far too long. It is in the transmission lines that we will carry reliable, affordable, and green transmission to the north. The last remaining communities in the Ring of Fire region are operated by diesel generation. So we have an incredible opportunity, and as we build those transmission lines, as you've seen in the recent past, we are doing that in full partnership with First Nations, 50-50 equity partnerships. It is in things like broadband we will set out to build so the young person in a remote community has the same access to education and opportunity as anyone here in Toronto. It is in the evolution of the skilled labor forces through increased opportunities to train, be certified, and enter the workforce. We are now actively looking at the design and contour of a skills development fund tailored specifically for First Nations and specifically for major construction, legacy infrastructure, and resource projects. Because this is about building the backbone of a stronger province, infrastructure that supports not just resource development, but people, families, small businesses, entrepreneurs, and communities that are ready to grow, that are ready to lead and be part of something bigger. Conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, when we build that foundation right, something powerful happens. Major projects, including infrastructure and resource development in their respective supply chains, will meaningfully include, in fact, they will require the mobilization of First Nations businesses and talent. Opportunity will not have to be flown in. It will live there. It will grow there. It will belong there. Opportunities for a generation of Indigenous people who have been told for far too long what they cannot do and who are now finally in a position to show this country what they can do. So that pilot who trained at Tyendinaga, who flies equipment and supplies into a community that looks very much like the one she grew up in, as I started speaking about, that young woman learning to fly, learning to weld, learning to lead businesses owned and operated by First Nations is where I want to end. And so to the question, who's going to build this country in the decade ahead? She will. We think that's a good thing. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for this extraordinary opportunity.
I don't think anyone's... You're here.
Oh, I'm on this side?
Yeah, you're on that side.
It's good to be on the right side of Lisa, having served in cabinet with her.
That's a joke. No, it's because they put my mic on this side. Minister, that was lovely. Thank you for talking about female pilots. Did you see that there was Air Canada advertised that they had a fully Indigenous crew on one of their flights? I think it was in the spring.
Yeah, I mean, this is where the opportunity is. We thought it was fitting to mention pilots, but the fact of the matter is that increasingly, and as I said from the outset, most, if not all of these projects that we're contemplating can be, have to be, and will be built by a well-trained and mobilized First Nations workforce.
Yeah, and it's very telling as well. I mean, we've known the statistic about the largest group of youth growing, or the how did you put it? The demographic that's growing the fastest is Indigenous youth.
And comprising the workforce, especially in Northern Ontario and in pockets of Southwestern Ontario as well.
Yeah, I'm gonna take a moment, and I may need more than a moment because you've had many titles, but I just want to reflect. So you were elected in 2011?
2008.
Oh, are we the same year?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I forgot about that. So
I mattered back then, clearly.
You did. Shocking. We were in caucus together. Yeah. So Kenora Rainy River, you were the Parliamentary Secretary for Officials Languages.
Yeah.
Then you moved to Minister of State for Science and Tech. And then you went in to be Minister of Natural Resources.
Yeah.
So out of all of those, what was the big learning you took away from federal government?
I think that I'd always viewed my experience as a work in progress and really understood that whether it was working as a nurse or a lawyer and then a politician, advocacy was a central tenet of all three of those professions.
Right.
And, you know, the learning curve for me politically had always been along the lines of how to be pragmatic and how to actually make things work. I don't think people use government and make things work necessarily in the same sentence. But I was fortunate, as you were, to work with a Prime Minister like Prime Minister Harper and honestly, Lisa, working with Minister Strahl and Minister Duncan in my capacity as the Parliamentary Secretary to what is now Indigenous Services Canada, I think was the best opportunity I had to to energize and to infuse a lot of the work that I had done in my previous professions in government.
And you probably had to stick handle a lot of the private members' bills that were that were coming forward at the time, which were difficult because they may not have been trying. They came at us from a good place, but they weren't going to solve the problem they sought to solve.
Yeah, I mean, the one I would think of is probably Rob Clark.
That's what I'm thinking of, Rob Clark's,
You know, and his, a First Nations RCMP officer and a great member of Parliament. Really a piece of legislation that First Nations political leaders have had a very difficult time with, and rightly so. One would conclude that it is likely created the kind of relationship that has just not been and acted to the net benefit of First Nations people, certainly not their businesses, and reflect some of the things that ultimately they would require to be meaningful partners in major economic and infrastructure projects, including resource development.
And that whole experience must have fed into the way that you're approaching Indigenous participation, Indigenous relationships. It's like, I loved what Dean said before, and Chief said it at the same time he was saying, which is no partnerships without relationships.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably the biggest stride that we have made. I appreciate the Premier's understanding of this and how he's embraced it. I mean, yes, it's a long title, but it's really giving effect to economic reconciliation as a major policy tool that is delivering results. I wouldn't be in it if it didn't. And of course, the Ring of Fire economic and community and economic partnerships have been our government's signature effort to ensure that First Nations have an opportunity to invest in their own communities and their priorities, that those priorities are shared. That's good public policy. And that to the extent we get alignment on major corridors that represent to the net benefit of those communities and their prosperity and the prosperity of the people of Ontario writ large, is important. And I should just mention, Lisa, it's not confined to Northern Ontario. There have been some great projects here in Southern Ontario. Six Nations of the Grand River Enterprises have done some fantastic work in battery storage, and the participation of First Nations communities in southwestern Ontario, I believe, will serve as a great model for how Indigenous sovereign wealth funds and participation in major businesses and industry can happen and be done the right way.
So you held the energy portfolio federally, you had it provincially. You kind of have it in a way within your Indigenous partnerships, especially being the Minister for Ring of Fire. Now, I'm going to be a little controversial here for a second. You're okay. But drawing on all this experience, when you take a look and see that car companies, auto manufacturers are kind of pivoting away from EVs right now, what's the business case for maintaining that the Ring of Fire is going to be essential?
Well, first of all, critical minerals plays a significant role in so many other sectors. You know, as I said, the defense industries of the United States at least, but other allies of Canada. You know, the platinum series or profile that's in the Ring of Fire and in other areas have application in so many different sectors. Is there anybody here that has one of those things called an iPhone? Does anybody have one here? Oh, they might just have some critical minerals. That's not electric vehicles. And battery storage, of course, is probably one of the more exciting ways to harness electrification and hopefully mitigate the impact of peaks and peak flows and how that affects pricing of electricity, industrial and for people heating and electrifying their homes.
So to the naysayers out there, and there are naysayers, right, saying, oh, the Ring of Fire, it's never going to happen in my lifetime. You're here to say, we're starting a road next week.
Yeah, well, it's on. I hope that my words today made that perfectly clear. You know, I ran into the chief of Martin Falls this morning. He was here on business meetings. Him and the chief of Webequie, as well as other First Nations communities, are working with companies like, you know, like CN, like Wailu. I mentioned Kiewit, Bird Construction. You're seeing more sophisticated law firms working in the region, not to disparage any lawyers that are practicing in the area, but certainly the kinds of commercial relationships that are coming together increasingly are complex and require their attention. May as well do a shout out for CIBC while I'm here, and I know there's other banks represented who are doing great work.
They are.
In full partnership with First Nations and First Nations businesses. There's a heck of a lot more work to be done, but I remain eternally optimistic, and frankly, to answer your question, you know, I like to, you know, wind my way there purposefully like a bumblebee, I guess, is that these are being done in full cooperation and support of our government with First Nations businesses and communities.
So the question from the audience fits right with that, which is, have you thought about the governance of the road?
It's probably the number one topic after we pre-position the sort of fundamentals of, you know, access to capital to be full partnerships, mobilizing the workforce. Governance is important to the isolated communities for a host of reasons, not the least of which is to preserve and protect the traditional ways that those First Nations communities have lived for time immemorial. And that comes down to hunting and fishing. I can't help but think, living right not too far from the Minnesota border, that new roads and corridors into previously inaccessible parts of Northern Ontario will be irresistible to Minnesota fishermen and hunters from across the country who would have access to lands that are pristine. They are important carbon sinks, and they are also a place of sustenance for First Nations communities. So governance of course, is a critical and key issue, and that engagement happens synchronously with the evolution of getting the project started themselves.
Yeah. What do you think is some of the biggest challenge that you're going to be facing in this? I don't think you have the challenge anymore of getting on a political agenda. I think you're there. I think now you set out a pretty big vision. Mm-hmm. We've seen some smallish steps along the way. But what does the timeline look like, and what are you worried about as you roll through this?
Well, I mentioned it in my remarks. We're starting construction on 3 locations in the Corridor to Prosperity. This is a corridor roughly the length or the distance between Toronto and Montreal.
Yeah.
Imagine that. This is a corridor that will support technologies, electrification, alternative energy, important energy. It's not alternative energy, sorry folks at Enbridge, but complementary forms of energy infrastructure, which have proved to be important in the development of Northern Ontario. I think it's really important that folks understand that the face of critical minerals is moving beyond the southern part of Northern Ontario. Mm-hmm. And our biggest challenges lie in exactly that. Mm-hmm. Protecting and preserving the pristine landscape that is Northern Ontario. And as well, and I think probably the single biggest one, is mobilizing a workforce to actually build that infrastructure and to work those mines. Mm-hmm.
You're a minister, but you're also a local politician. Mm-hmm. So when you go door to door in either an Indigenous community or in Kenora or wherever else in your riding, what are parents telling you what they want for their future? Because Northern Ontario is a very different place than down here in the south.
Well, it's not just my community, Lisa. I'm hearing it from First Nations communities. I'm hearing it from folks in Sudbury, Kapuskasing, and from North Bay to Red Rock. Mm. We want our families to stay here, to stay there. We want them to see opportunity the way many folks see it in larger city centers and in Ontario and other parts of the country. We believe that done properly, we can create training opportunities that are home-based, that are culturally appropriate, that provide the kinds of supports and complementary access to different technologies that will equip that workforce and invest in those communities. Phil Vanette, since passed, but he used to say, there's a gold boom back in the day, but somebody should tell me about it. I'm the mayor of the town where this is apparently happening. And it was because he had a workforce that was from somewhere else, that it was just the bare bones folks that lived in basic service and supply sectors for Red Lake. And frankly, First Nations communities in and around that area were not involved much at all. So that's what I'm hearing at the doorstep. Let's make those investments. Let's try to ensure that prosperity means the same thing to somebody in Martin Falls First Nation, Webequie First Nation, Arrowland First Nation, the communities in and around Greenstone, who are now not just a part of impact benefit agreements, but wanting to build transload facilities, major rail opportunities, and other kinds of infrastructure, oil and gas supply and distributors. And that means keeping jobs there, creating new jobs there, and having sturdier economies than what the commodity cycles have thrown at us in the past.
Okay, Colleen's giving me the sign. Last question, in a sense. So when you talk about jobs, we're talking a lot about labor-based jobs. I'm from Cape Breton. They're fantastic jobs, and they keep my community going. And no, you can't have any more Cape Bretoners working in the north. We need to keep them. We need to keep them at home as well. But equally, all of the stuff that you just talked about as well needs lawyers. It needs engineers. It needs accountants. We need lawyers. I'm a lawyer. It needs accountants. It needs C-suite level people making decisions.
Yeah.
We're in a room here, so, Bay Street room. What responsibility do we have in our companies to make sure that there's training opportunities for people from the North?
Well, I think it makes perfect sense, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, that if these projects are characterized and populated by First Nations owned and operated businesses and the kinds of community partnerships that are building local infrastructure, two things come to mind. Be a part of those opportunities and make sure that they include First Nations people. I think increasingly businesses of all sorts are doing that. I see just the conferences that I've been attending increasingly, from the London Stock Exchange to First Nations Major Project Coalition Conference, and there are many, many others across Canada, big and small, are more about First Nations business leadership, owning the supply chain, and from extraction, obviously, to processing and through to final products, knowing that they are going to be a meaningful part and prominent in those sectors. And so you need to get with the times and engage. Yeah. And I think you'll see very quickly that it makes perfect sense. We're learning as a government, but our successes so far tell us that we're on the right track and that we should keep going.
Yep. And training is not just a responsibility of a level of government, it's the responsibility of corporate Canada as well.
I think that's the big message is, folks have learned in the past, especially the private sector, who I'm largely speaking to today, that what happens if there's an over-reliance on government. We see things the opposite, and that's a message we're getting increasingly from First Nations political and business leadership, and that is to engage us, to form meaningful partnerships, or get out of the way.
Indeed. Minister, you, as you pointed out, you have worked as a nurse in the communities, you've worked as a lawyer in the communities. You also have an MBA, which you don't normally mention, but you have that as well. And you've held many and varied top important ministerials. I think sometimes, to be honest, if I could say, Greg, you sound like a pitch for a CBC sitcom.
Okay, well, as I used to say, I've spent a lot of time in school. I became a politician. My dad is still waiting for me to get a real job. So fortunately, I have the incredible career of nursing, and nursing gave me an extraordinary opportunity to live and work in First Nations communities for more than a decade of my life. And my legal and political work was born from those experiences. I'm tremendously grateful to have learned and to continue learning and to build the kinds of partnerships that I saw then and know now are the way forward.
We're lucky to have you in this role right now, Minister. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Minister Rickford, thank you once again for joining us at Canada's Podium and sharing your perspective on the opportunities ahead for our province and country. Lisa, thank you so much for guiding today's discussion with such insight and energy. I would once again like to thank Deloitte and Enbridge for their generous support of today's events, and thank you as well to our production partner VVC Live for their consistently excellent support both in-room and online. Before we close, I'd like to highlight a few upcoming events. On June 1st, we present Canada's Food Moment, featuring Justine Hendricks, and President and CEO of Farm Credit Canada, and Alison Sundstrom of Naya Ventures. On June 8th, we host our annual Evening Pride event discussing LGBTQ2+ representation on screen. And on June 15th, we are pleased to welcome Canada's ambassador to the United States, Mark D. Wiseman, in conversation with Daryl White, CEO of BMO Financial Group. Please visit CanadianClub.org for more information on all of these upcoming events. Members and guests, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate your continued engagement with Canadian Club Toronto, and we look forward to welcoming you back again soon. Have a great afternoon.